Go ahead to the next slide. Thanks. So just a little bit about us before we jump in. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, Smart Growth America, we're a national nonprofit organization. This is our mission here. We're also a collection of programs, including Transportation for America, one of our programs, which is our transportation arm and our main sponsor for this particular webinar. Transportation for America is working toward a transportation system that connects people to jobs and other essential services, regardless of their income level, regardless of their abilities, and by all modes of travel. And we do that through a combination of reports and analyses and direct technical assistance and then policy advocacy. Next slide. This week, in honor of Earth Day and the Biden administration's climate summit, we are hosting a series of webinars all about how to reduce emissions from the transportation sector, why we need to go beyond simply electrifying our vehicle fleet. Not that that isn't important, it's crucial. We absolutely need to do that ASAP on an incredibly accelerated time frame, but it's not sufficient by itself to meet our ambitious climate targets and make transportation accessible for everyone. We need to give Americans more options than just driving and how they get around to make their daily trips to work, to school, to groceries, all of their daily needs. Too many people in this country currently have no choice but to drive. So this is, of course, about our climate and reducing the emissions from the transportation sector, but it's also about benefiting the millions of Americans who either aren't able to drive, who can't afford one personal vehicle basically for every working adult in their house, or who just don't want to be driving further and further to make the same basic trips. If you want to join our conversation about this on Twitter, you can use the hashtag BeyondEVs. We're using this this week. Next slide, Jenna. And I'll just make a couple little plugs for the other webinars we're doing this week. Yesterday, we hosted a great panel with our partners at Third Way and a great collection of speakers on the lasting negative impacts of the construction of urban freeways, carving through neighborhoods in many cities, especially neighborhoods of color, and doing lasting harm to those communities. We had a really good lineup of panelists, including former US DOT Department of Transportation Secretary Anthony Fox. That link to that recording should hopefully be available soon. And if you missed that, I would definitely encourage you to check that out. And then tomorrow, you still have a chance to join this one. We'll be doing a session on how and why basically to increase our funding for transit to the same level as highways at the federal level. So we'll talk about basically why we aren't currently doing that, what the barriers are in federal policy and how we function that are currently preventing that, and how to overcome those barriers. Next slide. Today, though, we're going to talk all about why and how we need to reduce how much we drive, how much people are required to drive in the US to participate in the economy, to, again, meet, just their basic daily needs. This is a report that we released last year in 2020 that compiles a lot of the research on how transportation and land use decisions contribute to more driving and ultimately more emissions in the US. It's called Driving Down Emissions. Would definitely encourage you to check this out. This report also shows that reducing emissions from transportation is doable, which is a good thing because there are other areas where making significant reductions in emissions is going to be really tricky, where we've already made a lot of the initial progress we can. So it's really important that we tackle these transportation emissions. So we'll talk about what's in this report, but we'll also, I'm going to go over some newer research as well that we've been doing in this area. So if you've tuned in before and heard all about this report, there's going to be some new content as well. And we will hear from a couple of states who are taking important action in this area, Minnesota and California. There are a lot of policymakers and climate advocates that have traditionally focused, when we're thinking about reducing emissions from the transportation sector, have focused primarily on both electric vehicles and electrifying our car and truck fleet, but also on fuel efficiency. Those two areas tend to get the most attention, but there's definitely a growing awareness that reducing how much we need to drive is another important piece of this equation, an important step that we need to take to reduce our emissions from the transportation sector. So we'll hear from a couple states that are taking important steps in that area. Sam Rockwell, who's the executive director of Move Minnesota, partnered with us on this Driving Down Emissions report and a Minnesota specific case study. He'll sort of set the scene for how these issues play out in his state and talk about some progress that the state's been making recently. And then California, of course, is a leader in this area. So we're going to hear from Jeannie Ward-Waller, who is the Deputy Director of Planning and Modal Programs at Caltrans, about the state's new climate action plan for transportation infrastructure and how the state's going to be implementing that plan and reducing driving in the process. Next slide. So we know emissions from the transportation sector now make up the largest share in the US, and it's not trending in a good direction. Transportation relatively recently surpassed the utilities sector. And that's partially because after decades of incentives and policies that have basically reoriented almost all of the growth in our communities in the US around high speed, longer distance car travel, most people have to drive to do even basic things, even short trips that they need to take. And as a result, we're seeing emissions going up from the transportation sector. And in fact, emissions from the transportation sector are primarily made up of car and truck emissions. Next slide, Jenna. And you can see that basically we've been undermining our other progress that we've made in trying to reduce transportation emissions because we're seeing driving going up in the US. So vehicles, have become more efficient over the past couple decades. Emissions, though, have continued to go up from the transportation sector. And that's because we saw this large increase in vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. That's how we measure driving in this country over the same time period. So it's basically outstripping the progress we've made in terms of fuel efficiency. So we haven't seen the improvements that we want to be seeing. And the same premise is going to apply looking forward as we start to make progress in electrifying our vehicle fleet. We're basically at risk of undermining the improvements that we make in that area if we continue to see driving increase nationwide. These stats on the right are from a relatively recent study. Go back one, thanks. This basically found that we essentially need a travel budget if we want to meet our ambitious climate targets, even assuming that we're going to have some rate of electrification. Essentially, if VMT continues to increase, vehicle miles traveled continues to grow at 25 to 30% by mid-century, we would need to see a 73 to 79% electrification rate. Whereas if we can manage to reduce the amount that we're driving back to the 1991 levels, we only need to see a 50% electrification rate by mid-century to meet our targets. So basically, we have the opportunity to really help ourselves out here by tackling this issue, not just on the electric vehicle side, but also by addressing how much we're driving. And on the flip side, we are running the risk of really undercutting any improvements that we make on the electrification side if we aren't tackling how much we drive. Next slide. We also know that VMT, vehicle miles traveled, is a really powerful lever. Driving is directly connected to how much we emit. We can see the trends really clearly here. As driving increases, so do emissions. And what we saw in 2020 is that when our VMT dips, emissions also directly are impacted by that. Not that we want to, replicate those exact circumstances, but that shows that reducing vehicle miles traveled can have a real profound impact, that we can really make a difference if we can manage to get that VMT down. Next slide. But there are other reasons also that we don't want to rely exclusively on electric vehicles. One of them is that direct emissions from the tailpipe of cars and trucks is only part of, or one of the ways that we see negative impacts on the environment and on our climate from having a heavily or exclusively car-oriented culture and development patterns that require most people to be driving for most of their trips. For instance, batteries for electric vehicles are currently fairly carbon intensive to produce. Same goes for the vehicles themselves. So in the short term, we're not going to immediately see some of the progress we want while that's still the case. The process of simply constructing and maintaining more and more roads to accommodate that additional travel we're seeing also contributes to emissions. And then on top of that, there's sort of all of the other broader environmental impacts like impervious surfaces, particulate from tires. There's lots of ways that having a primarily car-focused transportation system is going to continue to cause degradation to our climate and our environment. Again, we absolutely need to do our transition to electric vehicles. This is not to say that that's not important. It's a huge priority. It's just can't be the only strategy. We need a multi-pronged approach. Next slide. And of course, we also know that car ownership is expensive, especially purchasing a brand new electric vehicle. And there are real disparities already in who has access to vehicle ownership. Racially, that's what this chart shows from the National Equity Atlas, but also, of course, by income level. We see real differences in who has access to personal vehicles by household. So if we stick with a primarily electric vehicle strategy, we won't address any of these existing disparities at all. We may even make them worse. Next slide. So yeah, so let's talk about how transportation infrastructure and land use policies contribute to growing vehicle miles traveled and contribute to climate, essentially. When we have clustered development, meaning that houses and jobs and schools and stores and all of those different destinations are close together, you can take shorter trips to meet your daily needs. And if those destinations are close enough together and there's safe infrastructure for walking and biking, you can even take those trips outside of a car. You could park once and walk to a bunch of different destinations before getting back in your car and driving home. Cluster development also makes transit more efficient to operate and makes it so more people have better transit access. So you don't get as much of the 90-minute transit trips where there's multiple transfers, and if the person misses the first transfer, then their whole trip gets thrown off, that you see in more sprawling car-oriented development, where your driving trips are also longer because those destinations are often spread out and separated. So housing will be in one area, shopping in a different area, jobs maybe downtown. All of the legs of your trip end up getting longer, and that compounds into much higher VMT. And so that's about land use decisions. Certainly that's where we locate our development, but it's also directly related to how we invest in our transportation system, because driving scale transportation investments, when we prioritize high-speed roads, connecting different areas, we end up inducing development in those areas that causes people to spread out more, and in a bit of a cycle. Next slide. Which is partially because of a little phenomenon called induced demand. This is something that I think folks in our field have generally kind of come to understand. It's been shown consistently in research, but a lot of policymakers still don't really see it this way. This is the idea that while intuitively you might think that if you expand a road, congestion will go down. In fact, what happens is over time you end up with the same level of congestion you saw previously, because people who were previously choosing not to take trips on that road because they knew conditions would be miserable, they knew that it would be congested, it would take a really long time, they actually, once you expand that road, they end up choosing to take trips that they wouldn't otherwise have taken. So it induces driving, it induces more travel. In the process, it also encourages more development to be more spread out, to sprawl more, because when you basically increase or improve the free flow conditions on a highway, that improves the travel time from further out in the fringes of the region to come into the city, say for your work. So people will choose to live further out, businesses will choose to locate further out where land is cheaper. But of course, that ends up inducing more trips and traveling further distances. So it ends up being this cycle where you expand the highway, you temporarily see a reduction in congestion, development follows that, but then pretty quickly that road fills right back up and you start hearing requests to expand that road again. And research has found over several studies have kind of come to the same finding, that there's basically an elasticity close to 1 for induced demand, meaning that a 1% increase in road capacity produces a 1% increase in driving. So you actually really don't get any congestion reduction benefits at all. Next slide. You can see this fairly clearly in the findings from our report, The Congestion Con, that we put out a little over a year ago. This report was actually specifically intended partially to try to illustrate this concept to policymakers. So we looked at the 100 largest metro areas in the US, found that basically our freeway capacity in those places increased at a faster rate than population. So you would think, ideally, based on that we would see at least congestion kind of like staying in check, being kept at bay. In fact, what we actually find though is that congestion exploded in those 100 urbanized areas over this time period. We saw a 144% increase in congestion in these places. So this shows, I mean, this isn't tied to population, and basically we can't get out in front of this. There's no level of investing in highway expansion where we could get ahead of this, get on top of this congestion. We need a fundamentally different approach. Next slide. So this is much more recent research we did that suggests that the impacts of induced demand are actually really significant. So VMT, vehicle miles traveled again, has gone up by about 56% over the course of these, I guess, 25 years between 1994 and 2019. Essentially half of that VMT increase was due to induced driving from highway expansion. The other half was due to things like population growth and other factors that you would expect, and also that we don't have a lot of direct control over. So I mean, this is huge. This is part of why at Transportation for America we advocate for a fix-it-first approach, because there's a real potential to, if not actually reduce or reverse the tide of vehicle miles traveled growth over the next couple decades, at least to really slow that growth, even as population is going up, if we stop or if we drastically reduce the rate that we're building these new or expanding these highways and inducing this additional driving. Next slide. There are other ways that our current transportation system is basically contributing to our transportation emissions and how those are going up. One of which is that by prioritizing high-speed car travel, the way that we typically design our roads, we're basically directly undermining the ability for people to take shorter trips outside of a car. In the US, almost half of trips are 3 miles or less. So theoretically, that would be a really great opportunity to convert some of those driving trips into trips by walking or biking or transit, other zero or low emissions modes. But we don't see that happening by and large because conditions are so unsafe, and a lot of that has to do with the speed of the vehicles. There's a direct connection between how fast cars are traveling, how unsafe the road feels traveling outside of a car, and then the rate of fatalities if you're struck as a person walking. These stats are for walking specifically, but it's similar for biking. If the speed of vehicle travel goes above 30 miles per hour, you see a drastic and rapid increase in the rate of fatalities for people walking. So there's a direct trade-off here. When we're building our transportation system primarily to get cars quickly from one place to another, we're basically directly undermining the ability of people to take even those shorter trips by walking and biking. Next slide. And we're seeing this national epidemic of rising deaths of people walking. This is our recent report, Dangerous by Design. We release this every couple of years. This is our 2021 edition. Essentially, we're seeing the number of people struck and killed while walking going up. Nationally, it increased 45% over the last decade. So we really need to make our streets safer for people traveling outside of a car. Otherwise, we're not going to see the change we want to on those shorter trips. Next slide. But so if almost 50% of trips are 3 miles or less, there's a whole other set of trips that are longer, contributing more to VMT and more to emissions. So we really need much better transit service as well. This is polling that we released about a year ago with Data for Progress and some other organizations. This is something that voters want. There's overwhelming support for better transit service. But we also heard in this poll that for those people who basically reported that their primary mode of transportation is a car, about 80% of those folks agree with the statement that they have no other choice but to drive. And about half of those folks reported wishing that they had more options, and a similar share reported that transit doesn't currently conveniently meet their needs. Next slide. And we also know that those needs, there's real disparity when it comes to those needs for transit service. There's real disparities in transit access in the US. This is a chart from the Urban Institute, but you can see similar research from all sorts of different organizations that transit access is significantly poorer in neighborhoods with higher poverty rates, neighborhoods with a greater share of Black residents. So when you take that, in conjunction with the disparities we see in things like vehicle ownership, it just paints this picture of this incredibly inequitable transportation system that we really need to address at a fundamental level, that simply focusing on electrification will do nothing to address, but that we can address by focusing on building the types of communities where people can affordably get where they need to go, either without a car or by taking shorter trips and reducing their transportation costs. Next slide. So what can we do? There's several things we can do, some of which I've already mentioned. One that I haven't is that we really need to make it more affordable to live in the types of places where people can walk and bike and take transit. Those are currently obviously some of the most expensive areas in the country, partially because there's a high demand for living in those areas. So that's about housing policy and housing affordability, but it's also about our land use regulations, our zoning, and the ways that we're artificially currently in many communities basically limiting the supply of housing in those areas, causing the price to go up, causing people to become displaced. We need to be able to increase the supply of housing in the communities where people have transportation access other than driving. We also need to make it safer to take those shorter trips. Like I said, we need to heavily invest in walking, biking, and transit. But then we also need to actually set goals for and measure not only greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, but also vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. We need to actually do that math of what it's going to take to meet our climate targets, even with ambitious electrification, and set ambitious targets to reduce VMT. Next slide. So several states have come to this conclusion as well, basically, that they're not going to be able to reach their climate targets on the transportation side without addressing vehicle miles traveled as well. So we're going to hear from a couple of them again about how they're taking steps to do just that. So I'm going to turn things over to Sam Rockwell, who again is the executive director of Move Minnesota. He's done a lot of work in this area at the state and the local level. Sam's going to talk about how this is playing out in Minnesota and what steps the state has taken recently toward reducing VMT. So go for it, Sam.
Thanks, Rayla. Yeah, I'll give a little bit of an overview of kind of where things are in Minnesota, climate-wise, general, and then walk through some of what we're doing now and give some of that context. So if we can go to the next slide. So first, some grounding. Minnesota has a climate reduction policy on our books, on the state books. It's called the Next Generation Energy Act. It is out of date and therefore inadequate. Our policies are to get us to an 80% reduction by 2050. It's actually passed under a Republican governor back in 2007. But although our goals are lighter than they need to be, given current knowledge, we are still not meeting them. So that is obviously a problem. This graph here is from a January 2021 report release from our state. So this is reasonably hot off the press of how we are going in the wrong direction here. Next slide, please. So why are we going in the wrong direction? Minnesota reflects the United States, as do a lot of states, in that transportation is our highest emitting sector. This has been true for a number of years now. This is a little bit of a funny graph because it shows our agricultural sector, both the positive and negative emissions of that sector. But transportation is the leading sector here in Minnesota. Next slide, please. The state recognizes that we have a problem, and so a couple of years ago put out kind of a multi-jurisdictional report they call the Pathways Report to articulate how we can get to adequate emissions reduction. And they actually, they both reflected on pathways to an 80% reduction and to a 100% reduction of emissions by 2050. So this was a good step, but given the politics of a Midwestern agricultural state, we have some quirks in this report. You'll see here reduction in vehicle miles traveled accounts for a very small percentage of the overall reduction here. Is that red bar, and part of that is because there is an extreme reliance on biofuels, because we have a lot of crop agriculture here. You know, when you actually get into the report itself, there's a reduction on relying on biofuels that involves technology that just doesn't exist yet. The state got a fair amount of pushback on those assumptions, that we would be developing new technology to reduce our emissions based on a technology that still burns things, and has since made some progress in considering what vehicle miles traveled might really be required. Reductions might really be required to hit our reduction targets. You know, part of the information that's gone into understanding why the Pathways report didn't really hit its mark is based on local research. So within the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the two biggest cities, twin cities in Minneapolis or in Minnesota, both of those cities have done fairly detailed research on what's needed to hit their own climate reduction targets by 2050. And both of them found really extraordinary amounts of VMT reduction would be necessary. So Minneapolis actually has the same targets as the state, an 80% reduction target by 2050. And they found that with, you know, reasonably aggressive EV adoption, they still need to have about a 38% reduction in vehicle miles traveled in the city of Minneapolis to hit their target. City of St. Paul, in their climate action plan, did a similar analysis, and they actually have a 100% reduction target by 2050, and found that they need to have a 50% reduction in vehicle miles traveled in the city of St. Paul. So, you know, those kind of come to about the same sense of scale there because of the different targets. So, you know, that, I think, seeing those two cities' analyses next to the state's analysis really created a push for something more. So next slide, please. You know, understanding what that something more needs to be based in understanding where we are. Minnesota is a little bit of an outlier across the country because of the number of highway miles that we have. These are the lane miles in the state of Minnesota. We get to rank number 5 in the country, although we are only 22nd in terms of population and 14th in terms of landmass. So our per capita lanes are really high, and that's driven by a number of factors. We have a constitutional mandate for highway funding. Effectively, we've got a set of taxes which are constitutionally dedicated under a state constitution for, quote, highway purposes. And then we have, as Rayla was noting, nationally, we have a lot of sprawl. And we have projected increase in sprawl over the next years. About 72% of the metro area, Twin Cities metro area, population growth over the next 20 years is projected in the exurban areas outside of the core cities and the first ring suburbs. So we're looking at projected trends, which don't have to be the actual trends, but projected trends, which kind of double down on this creation of induced demand through continued expansion of highways and land use patterns. Next slide, please. As a result, we're seeing vehicle miles traveled go up, just like the rest of the country is for the most part. Although we've seen a little bit of a dip. And what's interesting, next slide, is that we're actually kind of on paper doing a little bit better than the country in that our per capita vehicle miles traveled has gone down slightly over the last 15 or so years, and gone down about 3.5%. But with population growth, our total vehicle miles traveled going up, and of course our associated pollution is going up with that. And I'll just note briefly here that we're seeing the vehicle miles traveled going down in those center cities, first ring suburbs, staying pretty flat in our rural areas, and going up again in our more sprawling land use areas. And so that kind of fits with our knowledge of how this this gets generated. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of opportunity. State of Minnesota reflects kind of some of those patterns that Rayla noted nationally on what people want to see. On the left graph here is a graph of how people want to see our transportation system become more sustainable. This is from that state pathways report I mentioned earlier. You'll note that top 3 tied preferences are all related to bike and walking transit. Increasing transit, increasing bikeable and walkable communities, and then electrification of our transit system. The middle word cloud is kind of a funny one. That is from City of Minneapolis public outreach for what people wanted to see the city do in their own transportation action plan. And transit is obviously a massive priority and is outside of the city's jurisdiction. So not something that is going to happen through that city transportation action plan process, but does show how much people want to see changes on the ground. And there have been a variety of changes on the ground in some of the local areas, and particularly in the metro, which has been great, in part driven, I think, by some of those justice considerations that Rayla noted. We know that our transit system here serves disproportionately people of color. We've got 44% of the riders are people of color, 43% are people whose household incomes are less than $25,000 a year. A lot of those folks don't have access to a car. And a newish stat from this year, thanks to friends at Transit Center, is that our transit ridership in normal years is comprised 40% of people who are now considered essential workers, right? And so it's really a matter of justice to improve these systems and to start to shift how these modes work, not just a matter of increasing the ridership to reduce emissions. So, some of the local achievements recently, you see the picture on the right, the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul teamed up to reduce speed limits across the cities by 10 miles an hour on all neighborhood streets to 20 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour on kind of core arterial streets. Minneapolis got a fair amount of national attention for eliminating single-family zoning, starting to get at that issue that Rayla noted of there just isn't space for people to live in the places that are bikeable, walkable, transit accessible. And so by eliminating single-family zoning and allowing up to 3 units on every lot in the city, they're kind of making a long-term policy framework that will allow the city to grow in a more organic way. And then a variety of investments in biking and walking around the state, and some kind of individual line investments in the metro area. Next slide, please. So as Rayla noted, we partnered with Transportation for America on this Driving Down Emissions report and came out with a number of recommendations at the end of that report together, from setting VMT targets to reducing or stopping highway capacity expansion, incentivizing development, and continuing to invest in walkable, bikeable communities. And what's exciting, next slide, is that there's been progress since this report came out in October. There's been a lot of progress in just the last couple of weeks, actually. So the Minnesota Department of Transportation, State Department, came out with a preliminary 20% vehicle miles traveled reduction target for 2050. And this was the process of a year-long process with a committee that the Department of Transportation actually pulled together. They called the Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council. And they divided the council up into 2 work groups, a fueling work group and a vehicle miles traveled work group. Knowing full well what the VMT work group would come forward with as a recommendation. And so the DOT really deserves some accolades on this. And the VMT work group came forward with a recommendation to establish a VMT goal right now based kind of on precedents rather than starting a process of researching exactly what the right number is in Minnesota. We just know that we are out of time, and we have to take what some of our peer jurisdictions have done and understand and start to make some decisions. And so Department of Transportation did that. The work group, which we were able to participate in, looked at California, which we'll hear about in a minute, looked at Delaware, looked at Washington State, and basically said, here's what other people are doing. Let's pick one of these and run with it, and then commit to figuring out exactly what the right number is for Minnesota in the coming years, figure out what that means for folks living in rural areas versus folks living in urban areas where there is bike and walking transit, figure out what it's going to mean on a per capita basis as population increases, as projected, and so forth. And then just in the last few days, Hennepin County, which is the largest county in the state of Minnesota, it's where Minneapolis is located, came out with a revision. They actually delayed final action on their climate action plan. They came out with a revision to the draft, which the board will be voting on next week, which wraps the Department of Transportation's preliminary goal into the climate action plan. So this is less than a month after the Department of Transportation released their preliminary goal. The largest county in the state which has about a fifth of the state's population, has wrapped that into their climate action plan draft. And so that's a really, I think, just compelling example of kind of interjurisdictional coordination, of really being responsive, and of kind of tackling the kinds of timelines that we need to see in the future. And we're also seeing, kind of related to these, and it's been tied in through some reports and testimony on the local levels, both Minneapolis and St. Paul, looking at getting rid of their parking minimums, which are required parking for new development. And one of the main reasons cited there in those efforts is the induced demand that parking creates. Parking creates a similar process of induced demand by making it easier to drive as lane expansions. And so it's exciting to see all of this moving forward. Obviously, there are some big hurdles in the state, and we've got a lot of progress that needs to be made. But from a kind of a policy structure standpoint, the last couple of weeks and months have been exciting and hopeful, and we're looking forward to actually seeing this play out in infrastructural changes and budgeting changes over the next couple of years, we hope. With that, I will wrap up and pass it over to Jeannie.
Yeah, so we'll turn the baton right over to Jeannie Ward-Waller. Jeannie is the Deputy Director of Planning and Modal Programs at Caltrans. She's going to talk about their recent work on their plan and VMT reduction process. Go ahead, Jeannie.
Thank you, Rayla, so much, and great to follow Sam. Just hearing your presentation, there's so many parallels between what you're doing in Minnesota and setting targets and for what we're doing in California. So I will try to go fairly quickly through my slides so that we do have time to take some questions and have discussion at the end. I'm going to do a little bit on sort of the background policy goals that we have in California, and then focus in specifically, as Rayla mentioned, on this new document that is also pretty fresh off the presses. It's just in draft form now. It's called the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. We are just in the process of kind of taking public comments and finalizing that. So you're seeing something that is, really fresh, but it is really exciting, and I think points to all of the issues that Rayla touched on and how they intersect this issue of VMT reduction in transportation. So you can jump to the first slide for me, which just shows a picture of the contribution, different sector contributions to greenhouse gas emissions in California, which highlights why transportation is so important. You've heard about this already, but for California, We don't have quite as big of a contribution from the agricultural sector, but you can see transportation, specifically just tailpipe emissions, is already more than 40% of our contribution to GHG emissions. One thing I'd like to note on this graph is also kind of hidden. The emissions from fuel refining and production and extraction is captured under industrial. So when you think about the additional contribution that you get from that piece of the pie, we're up about 50% in California of our greenhouse gas emissions that really directly contribute to moving cars and trucks around our state. So it's a huge piece of the pie. We have a big obligation at the Department of Transportation and with all of our partners to reduce this piece of our emissions. So next slide. This is where I see a lot of parallels to what's going on in Minnesota. The next slide shows our climate targets. Our initial greenhouse gas reduction goal was set in 2006. AB 32 was the bill, also under a Republican governor at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and that set our initial target to get back to 1990 levels by 2020. We actually were able to meet that target, although that is largely on the back of the energy sector. So switching to renewables has gained great strides in California. And so we were able to hit that target even as, VMT and driving is increasing and the emissions in the transportation sector is going up. So what we're seeing is, our next target is 2030. We have to get to 40% below 1990 by that date. And that is going to be much harder to reach, and we're going to have to make a much bigger contribution from the transportation sector. And then we also have the same 2050 goal, get to 80% below 1990 emissions at that point. So, you can sort of see the steep curve that we've got to hit in the next several decades. And in California, of course, we're the sort of hub of technology out here. So a lot of our goals and progress have been very much focused on renewable technology, on vehicle technology, fuel emissions gains as well. So a couple of other recent policies, executive order and a bill are getting us even further in those areas. And the governor's executive order this last year got a lot of national media attention. So you might have seen this, but aiming for 100% new car sales in the state by 2035 to be EV. So, absolutely, I think this point between what are we going to get out of vehicle efficiency, fuel efficiency versus VMT reduction is an important one in California for us. So the next slide shows our we call it the climate change scoping plan. This is a required plan. It's produced by our Air Resources Board, one of our other state agencies, and it puts a lens on, how are we going to get there in the transportation sector? How are we going to hit our goals? So of course, zero emission vehicles, we talked about converting to cleaner fuels. That's also heavily regulated in California. And then reduction in vehicle miles traveled, which is what we're talking about today. We have a similar graph to the one that you showed, Sam, where, kind of shows that VMT is just a small slice. But one point that I really like to make is that the benefit or the pieces of the pie that you're going to get from vehicle, zero emission vehicles and then cleaner fuels, that assumes the most ambitious uptake of zero emission vehicles in the market, and also, hitting all of our targets on the fuel side as well. So we see it as a small slice, but if we don't hit the targets in any of those other areas, we're actually going to have to get a lot more out of VMT. So it sort of demonstrates why we need to just be deploying every tool in our toolbox to get to those goals, because we may not hit our targets in the other areas. So keep going. My next slide, I want to start moving into what are we doing now and this climate action plan on the infrastructure side that we're focused on. This plan was called for in 2019 by a governor executive order that really did put the focus on transportation infrastructure. How are we spending our highway dollars, our transit dollars, et cetera, leveraging that spending to help us meet climate goals. So there's a lot of language on the slide, but basically I want to just point to the second bullet there, reducing VMT by directing investments in a way that support infill, housing near jobs, and lots of other investments in our transportation system that helps us achieve, goals in all those other areas. So I'm getting a pop-up here. I'll go to the next slide. So the governor's executive order also called out all of our state infrastructure spending programs. So they're all listed here on the slide, lots of acronyms. I think what's important to call out is the state, just in our state funding, not including federal dollars or local transportation funding, we have about $5 billion a year that we spend on transportation infrastructure. So the governor called for, state agencies to leverage these funds collectively to invest differently in our transportation infrastructure and really, focus the state dollars particularly on, reducing VMT with other priorities. So next slide. So this brings me to CAPTI. And sorry, I realized in trying to trim my slide deck, I just left the acronym in without spelling out the whole thing, but CAPTI is the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, which I mentioned at the outset is this, draft plan that we've just released. It's, basically how we're going to implement this executive order. So how are we going to invest differently in our transportation infrastructure to meet all of those other goals, climate, of course, but also health and social equity. As Rayla mentioned, all these things are tied together. And so we really need to be thinking holistically about it. It is very much built on the foundation of fix it first. So we, rather than expanding, we've got to focus on fixing. And I actually I'm trying to shift to the language that the Biden administration used, which is not just fix it first, but fix it right. Making sure that, in fixing, we're building facilities for all roadway users and also thinking about climate resiliency. So fix it first is definitely guiding our investments, particularly on the roadway side. So I'll jump to the next slide and get into a little bit of the meat of what is in this CAPTI plan. So we've got 10 guiding principles, and then under that, 7 kind of focused strategies and how we're going to prioritize these investments, and about 30 actions. So we had a much longer list. We've had to kind of boil it down to what are the most important, most effective actions. And I think my next couple of slides will, I just want to give you a couple examples of those. I'm not going to go through all of them given our time, but I'll just hit on some of the highlights. So strategy 4 is really focused on how we're doing planning differently and also investing in different sorts of projects. At Caltrans, we're the state DOT, so we play obviously a really significant role here. And one of the ones I want to mention, that very first action, developing a strategic investment strategy, that's something that, it is kind of falls under my side of Caltrans, so I'm heavily involved in. And we are, reprioritizing, trying to move away from the old approaches of kind of adding new lanes to the freeways, adding capacity to our highways as sort of the go-to strategy to fix all problems. And now saying, we need much more targeted, much more innovative, much smarter and more sophisticated approaches to how we're investing in fixing transportation problems. Congestion is, a transportation issue. We want to solve it. We don't want people to be sitting in congestion. But as Rayla pointed out, we recognize induced demand. We factor that into our planning and our environmental process. And so because of that, we've got to move people in higher capacity vehicles, in transit, price the system. We've just got to be much smarter about how we're investing in our highways and providing people options to really get out of congestion, opt out of having to drive and sit in traffic. So go to the next slide, please. Another strategy here, looking for these innovative approaches, working with our local and regional partners is really important. I think the action that I want to hone in on here is the second one, which is convene a roadway pricing working group. So we know, pricing the system, making driving more expensive is a disincentive and helps to make other modes more attractive. So we're working closely with local and regional partners around this state. Been a lot of work, studies done in the Bay Area, in LA, even here in the Sacramento area, looking at how we can leverage pricing to help reduce VMT. So we're, at the state level, we're really trying to support and advance that conversation and look for some of those opportunities at the state level to reduce barriers and encourage more pricing of the system. And I think I'll just go ahead to my next slide in the interest of time and mention one more strategy. This one is really focused on equity, which, I always like to make sure we're putting that in the forefront as we're talking about, what needs to change in the transportation system. In California, we've really prioritized equity. We're trying to, look through an equity lens at everything that we're doing. So this strategy is really important, and there's a lot of areas that we're trying to really, improve community engagement, make sure that we're consulting with groups that really bring this expertise, not just, every time we go out and do a plan or project, but, really as we're looking through how we're changing the system and some of those higher level policies. So a ton of work being done here. One action that I just want to specifically mention is that last one, developing and utilizing an equity index to evaluate our projects. That is a key piece of that. I think, some people may question, why is this in the climate policy? We're very keenly aware that, the most marginalized communities are going to be the most impacted by climate change. And so it's really critical to be focusing in on disadvantaged communities and really those most severely disadvantaged or most marginalized by our system today when we're doing this work. So with that, I think I just have one more slide. Yep, so I mentioned this already, our CAPTI plan is out for comments now. We hope to finalize it in July, and we'll move forward in implementing all of the exciting actions that I talked about. So I'll pass it back to you, Rel. I hope we still have time for a little discussion.
We do. Thank you so much, Jeannie. Yeah, so we have time for probably a couple questions. We got lots of good questions in the chat, so certainly not going to get to all of them. We might do what we sometimes do, which is sort of a blog post summary after the fact, where we have our speakers all respond to some of these that we don't get to, but I will jump right in. This one gets at, it's sort of related to several questions that I've seen. So there was a lot of activity on this topic about a decade ago with all the work by Reed Ewing et al., Moving Cooler, Growing Cooler. Folks are familiar with those reports. A lot of the people involved in those conversations had their time overwhelmed by the shiny new world of electrification. What is required, or what can we do to basically to get the attention back to VMT, land use, and all of these issues? So I have a couple thoughts, but I really want to hear from Jeannie and Sam about how your states basically move toward recognizing this as a priority, if you can speak to that. But I will say, so this driving down emissions report that we linked to a few slides ago, that was actually specifically our intention, was sort of to like revamp that growing cooler, moving cooler research for a modern audience and try to make it more accessible to people today and policymakers today. And one of the things we really wanted to do with that, which I think is potentially part of the key of continuing to elevate the importance of VMT and land use, is pointing to the whole system of issues that helps to address. The demand for those types of communities, and also the fundamental disparities and inequities that exist in our current transportation system. Why an electric vehicle only approach won't address any of those climate justice issues, and trying to bring the attention back to that. But Sam or Jeannie, do you have thoughts on how your states have sort of come around to why this is a priority, and how other states might be able to move in that direction?
I'm happy to jump in on the point, Rayla. I mean, I think one thing that, one thing that did happen in the sort of 10-year plus ago time horizon was that we really shifted how we're doing planning. So I think the conversation did change and we adopted a law in California that required, coordination of sort of where we're planning housing, land use changes, general plans, and looking at the transportation investments with the lens of sort of what is that greenhouse gas reduction target in all of our major regions. So that was a huge progress, and we've seen a lot come out of, you know, much better planning work. A lot of jurisdictions now have climate action plans. All that is great, but your plan is only as good as how much of it you implement, right? And so I think what we didn't see was those plans necessarily result in a different kind of investment. And so, you know, we're resetting that conversation now. I think what's really exciting about our current plan that I just talked about is we really are focused on those transportation investments and making a totally different set of investments. And so that, you know, that is, I hope, going to have a bit, you know, make a bigger difference in actually changing, you know, how we're growing. So I think on the point about electric vehicles, from my perspective, being in a state DOT, you know, putting people in a different vehicle doesn't fix any of the transportation problems that we're struggling with, right? Like it doesn't help people get around any easier. They're in a clean vehicle, but they're still sitting in traffic. So investing differently, again, investing smarter in our system, putting a focus on, you know, low-income people and meeting their needs, you know, to me, that's about solving a transportation problem. So I don't know if that totally hits on the point you're trying to make, but, you know, yes, we need electric vehicles, absolutely support that. But from where I sit at the state DOT, I want to fix people's ability to get around their communities and access their daily needs and improve their quality of life. And that is a totally different problem than just switching vehicle technologies.
Thanks, Jeannie.
I'll add very briefly, just, you know, mostly with we're kind of in the same boat as what Jeannie and Rayla touched on, but one other thing that's been pretty explicit here is kind of looking at specific past examples, for example, freeways that have cut through Black communities, and trying to understand the impacts that the past infrastructure decisions have made, and to make different decisions. And you know, we have had a lot of pretty direct and hard conversations about race in Minnesota and Minneapolis recently, very recently, as probably everybody knows, with Chauvin verdict, George Floyd murder, and all the affiliated events over the last year. And, you know, those are reflective of our long history here. So really tying together that climate and justice issues has been critical.
Thanks, Sam. I think we have time for maybe one more. So somewhat on a similar theme, we got a number of questions generally related to the issue that providing walking and biking and transit infrastructure and making communities more accessible often increases the price and can displace the folks that currently live in those communities. Can either of you speak at all to how, if at all, that's addressed in your state's climate plans, how you're working with other partners, how that fits into this?
I mean, I can talk very briefly. You know, I mean, I mentioned a little bit ago that, for example, City of Minneapolis eliminated single-family zoning. There's been a fair amount of discussion around the need to provide, you know, space for growth. I mean, those we can't not invest. I mean, the answer to gentrification concerns can't be we're not going to invest in underserved communities. We need to find a way of providing ways to both invest in those communities and keep those current residents, business owners, and so on there. So, you know, providing more space is one thing. We have inclusionary zoning in some cities now, which means it's required affordable housing for new development. And there's been discussion of tying together transit investments and pots of money for housing, which I think we are not a leader on this. We should be, but you know, I'd point, I guess, most recently to Austin, Texas's referendum for transit, which is, you know, has money specifically in it for housing, and I think that's a compelling way of thinking about this.
Yeah, Rayla, I know we're out of time, but that it's a super important question, and we've got to be thinking intersectional. I think one thing that's really exciting about what's going on in DC, the Biden administration, you know, this like big vision for investing in infrastructure in the Americans Jobs Plan includes, housing, it includes broadband, it includes, all of those sort of basic infrastructure investments that you need to make infill more affordable, which is a really key problem in California. I mean, when you're talking about displacing people here, like we're displacing people onto the streets. There is no housing available for that low income sector. So it's a huge problem. I think, I'll just go back to like making sure that equity and community engagement and like meeting the needs of the people that are most marginalized in our system, like needs to be the focus of what we do in state government. So yeah, just it's a really tough one, but I think the obligation is on us in public service to really be thinking about all those issues when we're making improvements to the transportation system. Thank you.
Here. So we are out of time. One question that I really wanted to get to that we didn't is about California's new tool for calculating induced demand impacts. So I just dropped a link in the chat. You all should definitely check this out. This is really cool. We're looking at trying to replicate this in other places. So definitely worth a look. And thank you to our speakers again for joining us. Thank you all for joining us, and keep an eye out for the recording link, which we will share. Thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Rayla.